From here I'm muted.
Yes.
Say something. Let's see if she can hear you. Tulika, can you hear Manpreet?
Hi, Tulika, can you hear us?
Yes, yes, sir. Yes, sir. I can hear you.
Oh, great.
Why are people sitting in the back? Why did you come here? If you come sit this side. We are waiting.
You can come here.
Apala is joining in. Hi, Apala, can you hear us?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Very good. And Apala is Pittsburgh. You're from Pittsburgh, right?
Yes, I'm from Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh. Pennsylvania. Alexis has joined. So Serenah has to join now. And Samrat. Actually, it's not yet 5:45.
How are we doing?
I'm good, thank you. I couldn't see who said hello.
I said that. I said.
Roshan, you remember Roshan?
Yes, hello, sir. How are you?
You look so different. You're great a lot now, Samrat.
Yes, sir.
He likes to change colors once.
Yeah,
in a while.
you love to change colors, right?
Yes, but this time it's all natural now. This is not
Oh.
colored at all.
Looking good. Looking good.
Thank you.
We had some very interesting sessions this morning. Okay, so if you're ready, can we begin? Great. On behalf of Melow, the Society for the Study of the Multi-Ethnic Literatures of the World, I welcome you all. And this is a special session that we have for our delegates from abroad. And they're all here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 5 of them. We started this morning. We had a very interesting keynote by Niladri Ranjan Chatterjee. And we have it recorded. I'll share the recording with you whenever I can manage it. I have to upload it and I'll share the link. And we had a lot of other sessions also. The aim is to put together a decent collection of essays, which we can try publishing with one of the top international publishing houses. Melow is a society that has been around since 1997, and we've been doing a lot of work organizing conferences, seminars, and so on. People like Gonul and Samrat are familiar with the society, but Alexis and Serenah, you and Apala, for you, probably you're not familiar with it. So we've been around and we have a certain credibility in not just in India, but internationally also. We have held 26 conferences so far, and this is the 27th. Lately, we started last year or so, we started the mini Melow series. And in this mini Melow series, what we do is we take a theme and we invite people to contribute essays, which later on go into a book, into an anthology. We had one while I was teaching in Sonipat last year, And that is going to come out anytime now because all the formalities, editing, proofreading, all that has been done. And this also hopefully should lead to another good publication. I know you have already submitted your essays to me, and some have not yet been able to do so, but never mind. We will wait a few days, and we'll also give out a call, an open call for papers, because we would like some more international contributors. So if you pass the word around, that would really be nice.
Yes, of course I will.
Yes. And then, of course, the usual process will take place, scrutiny and revisions and so on. But we work according to deadlines. And I think there's no reason why we should not be able to put together a book that we can all be proud of. So I would request you all, after today's session, please revise your paper, because you see, when you read it out, you realize that there's something missing and something needs to be worked on more. So revise it. We'll give you a few days and get back and just spread the word around. There are so many people who are working in this area, who are experts in this area, who probably would love to publish on a theme like this. So just pass the word around so that we get a good pool of essays. Okay, so in this session, we have 5 speakers. We have Serenah Mnasian. How do you pronounce your name, Serenah?
Mnasian.
Mnasian. Okay, we have Serenah and Alexis Mnasian. We have Apala Kundu. We have Gonul Bakay, and we have Samrat Sharma. We are going to begin with Serenah now. Serenah, why don't you introduce yourself? We know that you're from the University of Western Illinois, but just tell us a little bit more about you. You get about 12 to 15 minutes of speaking time. And at the end, we'll have a discussion on all the papers together. Okay, Serenah, over to you. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and read your paper.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Serenah Mnasian. So I have a master's and PhD from Illinois State University, and I just graduated with my PhD this past May. So I've been teaching now. This is my 7th year of teaching. So my specialty is British literature, the Romantic era, and also women, gender, sexuality studies, queer studies, and feminist theory. So my paper incorporates all of those things and also has an emphasis on pedagogy. Okay, well, nice to meet you all. So I will go ahead and get started. I'm reading from another screen, so my will be turned a little bit. So my paper is titled Recrafting the Romantic Canon. So spanning from 1785, 1832 is the era of Romanticism, a time that revolves around nature, finding the joy and beauty in the mundane, understanding one's own place in the world, embracing the bounds of family, mourning death, and thinking about afterlife, contemplating what is real and what is imagined and desired, depicting the awful around us, seeking one's own understanding of the world, and most of all, learning from the world around us. The Romantic era houses several events that shifted the period in the centuries to come. One event is industrialization, which was the increasing rise in factory work that shifted the ways in which individuals worked, lived, and performed within a role in society. The industrialization heavily impacted Romantic life, works, and society, causing the Romantics to reject this industrialized idea of life and instead seek out their desire to learn from nature and the world around them for knowledge, understanding, and experience. One Romantic author that encapsulates this Romantic mindset is John Keats, who ends this famous poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn, by saying, "Beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know, and that is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know." Lines 49 through 50. Keats emphasizes nature's necessity to serve as a teacher in an individual's life and emphasizes all we can learn from the world around us and the necessity to do so. As the centuries pass, the study of Romanticism continues to provide knowledge and research as it has expanded into a plethora of scholarly conversation, research, thought, and continued discussion, but is not going deep enough. At the beginning of my Romantic education, I was continuously encountering the same pedagogical approaches, the Big Six canonical method of teaching, which limited my exposure to Romanticism and instead allowed me to only learn via a narrow lens that revolved around privileged white men. Scholar Julie Schaffer discusses the focus on these men as she writes, quote, "The canonized poets and their works have continued to define what Romanticism is. Canonical Romanticism has thus been synonymous with the Romantic poetry of 6 figures and despite challenges, this construct has proved not easily shaken, displaced, or significantly altered. Page 469. Schaffer proves true, as I noticed that throughout the continuance of my academic career, one thing in particular is the commonality among Romanticism courses. They all consistently teach the same figures and works. Exposure to the Big Six Romantics is quite conventional, as most educators discuss William Wordsworth, William Blake, Lord Byron, John Keats, Percy Shelley, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The canon being privileged is a common trend numerous educators practice, and scholars such as Michelle Levy, Susan Wolfson, Anne Mellor, Harriet Lincoln, and Elizabeth Fay have heavily discussed, but have only focalized attention to gender. While studying Romanticism over the last 7 years, I have noticed the continual focus on the canon, which brings common themes of underrepresentation, privileging, and exclusion, which must be discussed and dismantled. The repetitive discussion and exposure of the canon has led to a place in scholarship where non-canonical authors are now being discussed more, but not fully. The continued discussion and teaching of these 6 authors has allowed me to enter into and digest scholarship around it, and additionally take a different pedagogical approach in my own research and teaching. Rather than continuing a cycle of teaching and learning based on scholarly discussion of white male heterosexual privilege, it is important to break this cycle and instead reverse the current teaching and learning of Romanticism. Dating back to the 1980s, there has been a discussion of Romanticism and gender along with dismantling the canon, but there is now a need to further the conversation. In order to shift the study, discussion, and teaching of Romanticism, pedagogy and scholarship must implement a non-canonical perspective that dismantles and shifts focus away from the Big Six in order to further the conversation that past scholars have started. The work necessary to dismantle this privileging of the canon must go a step deeper and uncover the intersectional elements of identity such as gender, sexuality, and race that have not been heavily discussed, taught, or brought into contemporary scholarship in classrooms. In the field of Romanticism in the late 1980s, Anne Mellor began unpacking the focus on the Big Six authors and began bringing awareness as to why other authors should be taught, which was crucial to the field. Mellor is recognized as a profound scholar in Romanticism, and as another scholar, Noah Comment writes that, quote, Anne Mellor has changed what and how we read as scholars of Romanticism, 291. Comment discusses the ways in which Mellor impacted the field and the field to come, and why she is so worthy of study and influence. In Mellor's work titled Romanticism and Feminism, she demonstrates this expansion of Romantic knowledge as she discusses the Big Six and describes the backbone of this model of Romantic thinking by writing, the critical canonization of only 6 of the literary hundreds of male and female writers of the early 19th century reflects certain assumptions deeply embedded in our political culture. Page 8. Mellor discusses the importance of focusing on other authors besides the conventional Big Six and begins progressing scholarship to do so, but limits the conversation here to gender. Gender has significant implications on Romantic scholarship, teaching, and learning, which built the canon. Rather than focusing on the canon, one of my pedagogical approaches is called reversing the canon. This pedagogical approach entails teaching canonical authors through the lens of non-canonical authors. It is important to discuss non-canonical authors first and decenter those who are often privileged as a part of the canon. An example of this is the teaching of the typically canonical author William Wordsworth through the teaching of his sister Dorothy Wordsworth, the author, journalist, diarist, and sister of William I. Beginning with the discussion of Dorothy, her works, then transitioning into the discussion of her brother William, will set a platform of focus on her first. Next, the teacher could then lead into the discussion of William, which creates a new version of male hierarchy typically seen in the canonical approach. Rather than teaching William first to educate students about Dorothy, I choose to teach students about Dorothy first to learn about William. In this approach, William, who was traditionally taught, discussed heavily, and deemed as a father of Romanticism, is decentered as the main primary focus, and now Dorothy is at the forefront, which is reversing the canon. The use of this pedagogical approach allows for new knowledge to be gained about an author that is not prominently taught, the ability to decenter privilege off of the canonical author, and to allow students to gain their own opinions on what works and individuals they enjoy most, rather than just the ones that they feel as if they have to enjoy due to popularity. This is an approach that reverses the gender biases and other implications of identity that are usually left undiscussed and now brings them to the forefront. Using a pedagogical approach such as reversing the canon provides a space where the canon is able to be taught but in an equitable way. Reversing the canon creates a space where canonical author's privilege is dismantled and discussed via the initial exposure to the non-canonical author. This pedagogical approach serves as a role reversal. The typical canonical author is a man and the non-canonical author a woman. So it is breaking gender hierarchies and reversing the conventional. Mellor discusses a similar way of thinking in Romanticism and gender as she writes, Quote, in writing this book, I have used a structural model which in itself is deeply problematic and whose limitations I wish to acknowledge at the outset. In order to recover the erased and neglected voices of the Romantic women writers, I have grouped their writings together under the heading of what I have called feminine Romanticism. I have tried to identify the concerns and ideological positions which they held in common with the other women writers of their day, and I have contrasted this material to what we have traditionally defined as Romanticism, which I have rechristened masculine Romanticism. Binary structure has the initial, and it seems necessary, advantage of allowing us to see what has hitherto been hidden, the difference that gender makes in the construction of British Romantic literature. And that's on her page 3. Mellow's tactic here is something that is very valuable to realize, as it is evident that Romanticism as a whole has been mostly accredited to men, which is evident by the Big Six canon. Due to these circumstances, Mellow changes the traditional or conventional to be titled masculine Romanticism, in contrast to feminine Romanticism, which she accredits to women. This wording shows how Mellow is depicting a field of Romanticism that is essentially completely male-dominated, which the canon also proves. Mellow's comparison and change in language prove the gendered biases, implications, and injustices regarding gender in Romanticism, and how this must be called to attention in both teaching and scholarship. While teaching, one of my pedagogical approaches to unpack gender and Romanticism incorporates Mellow's grouping by teaching all of the work as she described as feminine Romanticism. My course reverses the canon by entering into the conversation of a canonical author via a non-canonical author, which another example of this is the teaching of Mary and Percy Shelley, first beginning with the biography of Mary Shelley, her works, her successes, and analyzation of her work, that then transition into a discussion of her husband, Percy. By using this approach, the canonical author is again decentered, and instead the focus is placed onto the non-canonical author, allowing students to become educated on both figures equally, rather than just being taught the conventionally known canonical figure. Scholar Harriet Kramer Lincoln used a similar approach in her classroom, as she discusses in her article titled Women and Romanticism, Reformulating Canons in the Classroom. Lincoln discusses the positive reception students in her classroom had to the teaching of non-canonical authors by writing, quote, my discussion here provides anecdotal evidence to document the ways in which experiences in the classroom support feminist efforts to redefine the British Romantic canon. Page 45. Her classroom supported the feminist measures taken to revamp the canon. Lincoln's article was published in 1990 as she began making the shifts in her classroom and scholarship began, then exploring this idea that Mellor had been writing about since the 1980s. Seeing the quick uprise in these studies before 2000 proves that it is quite alarming how scholarship had progressed quickly in the past, but now only briefly, which is why it is crucial to go a step deeper and uncover the multiple intersections of identity that must be discussed, taught, and researched alongside Romanticism. Throughout this research, it is made evident that gender is very heavily discussed in terms of the canon and teaching, but scholars must go a step deeper and discuss sexuality in Romanticism. It is crucial to use past scholars' foundation, but continue to extend the conversation in terms of other aspects of identity, such as sexuality. Sexuality within Romanticism is discussed prominently in scholarship, but must extend into the classroom, which is why my teaching includes the very inadequately discussed Anne Lister. Lister was a woman during the Romantic era who was quite wealthy, wrote numerous letters and diary entries, had relationships with women, and is recently the star of the Amazon Prime series titled Gentleman Jack. Teaching of Lister provides a new perspective on Romanticism, enabling readers and students to see that there was a woman during the period who desired other women. Also, Lister highlights the ways in which Romantic society viewed sexuality. Lister dismantled conventional norms and proved that she is also worthy of study. Lister additionally broadens the theme of love and creates a more inclusive and relatable space in the classroom. In the article titled Where is Queer, Talia M. Vestry states that, quote, despite recent efforts of feminist critiques and the hashtag Bigger6 advocates to demasculinize and decolonize the period, Romantic studies still needs to deconstruct its dominant heuristics, a solution that queer epistemologies may offer. Page 186. Queering the canon does exactly this via teaching and researching authors during the Romantic era that are outside of the conventional white, heterosexual, and male privileging discourse. Queering the canon creates a space for all to feel connected to and understand the authors they are reading and take sexuality a step deeper than the canon does. In order to properly dismantle and recraft the canon, one must not only focus on gender and sexuality, but heavily on race. The Big Six in Romanticism are all white, cisgender men, which illuminates the privileged positions they're all a part of, which forms the canon. When discussing race and Romanticism, it becomes evident in the lack thereof. Scholar Manu Chander discusses the lack of race being both discussed in Romantic works and also scholarship, as the canon is usually the backbone depended on. Chandler writes, quote, "Now I love Coleridge and Keats as well as Wordsworth and Byron and Shelley. I admit to being ambivalent about Blake, but I'm incapable of forgetting what they would not have that they would not have loved me in return. Not even Byron, to whom I suspect I would not seem sufficiently oriental. I'm reminded of this deficiency every time I sit on a panel of romanticists who think like me but do not look like me. I find it significant that I felt the same soul blush on a panel at the annual conference of South Asia, where I was among scholars who looked like me to the outside observer but tended not to think like me. Regional studies and romanticism don't mix." Page 105. Chandler uncovers the privileging that the field of romanticism often falls guilty to and highlights the importance of Wang's argument of creating not only new scholarship, but new spaces that are equitable and inclusive in romanticism. Chandler also calls attention to privileging and highlights why it is important to continue the work of moving past the canon, not just in terms of gender and sexuality, but race also. Chandler highlights how many individuals do not feel as if anyone in the canon is relatable to them, creating a potentially isolating feeling of that is all that is taught or studied, which again emphasizes the importance of pushing against the canon as a solo form of study and teaching and implementing new and inclusive teaching practices. As studies in romanticism evolve, the work that is being done must strive to be more equitable, inclusive, and one that creates an environment that is welcoming for all. The scholars mentioned and many others have been the backbone that I've been building off of, which was a starting point in my research that provided an interest in the conversation and has now opened up a space where the importance of moving beyond just romanticism and gender has been proven. It is crucial to take the field of romanticism many steps deeper, such as this work has done, to reveal the numerous intersections of identity prominent in romanticism studies and their worthiness of study, along with the necessity of building pedagogical tactics such as reversing the canon and querying the canon to put this research into action and strive towards creating a new version of romanticism that is not centered around a canon. Moving forward, I will continue to progress the conversation and aim to create a space in romanticism studies in teaching and scholarship that focuses beyond the canonical and highlights the importance of all intersections of identity and romantic studies. Furthermore, my future goals in the field are to continue creating an equitable, inclusive, and accessible romanticism, and create and publish an anthology, a semester course plan, and continue striving to put my research out there so that I can help provide educators and students with the resources to make this progress possible. Thank you all.
Thank you, Serenah.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you very much. And talking about querying the romantic canon, this is a subject that has not really been discussed too much or worked upon. And I see that Alexis has a paper that links with this. Am I right? Because you mentioned Lister, and paper that Alexis wants to present is on, where is it? Lister's Queer History and Undesired Spotlight. Now, I think it would be appropriate to ask Alexis to present her paper so that we can take them both side by side and, see how they connect. Right?
Yeah.
So, Alexis, would you read yours, please?
Yeah, sure.
Please. Introduce yourself, please.
This is Alexis Mnasian, and I'm a student at Western Illinois University. I'm an undergrad and I'm a senior, and I'm graduating in May. I'm an English major, and my specialty is also in romanticism. Lister's Queer History and Undesired Spotlight. While exploring gender and sexuality in the Romantics, readers are able to see the ways in which some Romantic authors paved a path toward progression. Due to other issues of intersectional identity, some of these Romantic authors have been more or less studied in opposition to one another. Anne Lister is one of the lesser known, as she was a 19th century diarist who, quote, was a Yorkshire gentlewoman who resided in a manor house called Shibden Hall in the early 19th century. An heiress, she was able to educate herself in the classics. She expressed no interest in men, and she did not have to marry. Clark 23. Lister now gains popularity and scholarship due to the, quote, Gentleman Jack television series. Lister paved the way for contemporary lesbians and LGBTQIA+ members to be freely able to be with who they desire. Lister serves as a romantic author who did radical things that led to radical advancements that are finally now gaining attention in our contemporary society. By reading and unpacking the works and life of Lister, readers are able to see just how much of an impact they have made on the progression of queerness, gender, and sexuality. When learning about the life of Anne Lister, it is crucial to know the background behind the publication of her diaries. In 1880, Lister's 5 million word diaries were first discovered by John Lister after he inherited Shibden Hall. After decoding her diaries and discovering her secret life, he made the decision to hide the diaries behind the wooden panels of the home in an attempt to keep them away from being discovered by others. John Lister had reason to hide the diaries. He was gay and feared the, quote, Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885. One of the laws of the act was criminalized, quote, gross indecency between men, meaning homosexuality. This caused John Lister to fear, as he did not want to draw attention to himself, which caused him to hide the letters. After his death, the letters were later discovered. The publication scandal makes it evident that she did not intend to have these diaries published, just like most things in life. It was uncontrollable. Her diaries are full of heartfelt words, desire, intimacy, romance, and expression of self that shows just how much this lesbian of the past matters to contemporary LGBTQIA+ discourse. In the article, Anne Lister's Construction of Lesbian Identity by Anna Clark, she describes just how much of an impact Lister had on building lesbianism and lesbian identity to come. Clark describes Lister's writing and says, in quoted portions of her extensive diaries, Anne Lister wrote of her passionate relationships with women, noting every kiss, her term for orgasm, as she experienced. Although she did not use the word lesbian at age 30, she wrote, I love and only love the fairer sex, and thus, beloved by them, in turn, my heart revolts from any other love but theirs. Lister did not have the same jargon as we contemporaries do, but made it very evident as to who exactly she was desiring, sharing these experiences with, and writing about women. Such as many queer folks today suffer from not being accepted, being isolated from family, and not being understood, Lister seems to have possessed that same fear as she was writing in, quote, esoteric code. The introduction of her secret diaries goes into greater detail to explain this unwanted publication and the ways in which she had to protect her writing. Anne introduces the rudiments of what is eventually to become an elaborate code, her crypt hand, as she called it, the use of which allowed her the freedom to describe her intimate life in great detail. The idea of using an esoteric code appears to have had its roots in Anne's burgeoning knowledge of the Greek language. She mingles Greek letters with other symbols of her own devising. She felt safe in the belief that no one would be able to decipher the coded passages, and as her confidence grew, they became longer and much more explicit when dealing with those aspects of her life which could not be written about in plain hand. This passage shows anxieties that Lister possessed while expressing her love, life, and feelings on the page. This bold move that she made has helped to shape the ways in which lesbianism is now able to be freely written about in queer theory, gender and sexuality studies, journals, media, and many other outlets. Lister's impact on modern-day lesbianism proves to go deeper throughout the reading of her diaries. The first entry, dated on Wednesday, August 14th, in 1816, has the first appearance of Lister's same-sex relations, as she writes, I teasing and behaving rather amorously to her, she would have gladly have gotten into bed or done anything of the living kind I asked her. She is freely, under the use of her code, of course, writing about the potential intimacy or romance between her and her beloved. She takes things a step deeper in her next entry, dated Thursday, August 15th, as she writes about her same-sex desires very clearly. Anne sat by my bedside till 2. I talked about the feelings to which she gave rise, lamented my fate, said I should never marry, could not like men, ought not to like women, at the same time apologizing for my inclination that way, by diverse arguments made out of a pitiful story altogether, and roused poor Anne's sympathy to tears. This passage is a direct connection to lesbianism today and proves her paving a path of what is to come. Lister expresses how she is talking to her beloved Anne and describes to her that she has feelings for her. She does not like men, so she will probably never marry, as same-sex marriage is illegal, and she apologizes for making this other woman feel this way and taking her down the dark side, as contemporaries often categorize the lesbian lifestyle as a reclamation of derogatory feelings toward it. Lister is not only expressing her lesbian desires, but also does what most lesbians struggle with today, apologizing for who they are. This entry by Lister shows her direct linkage to modern-day lesbianism and how she was a monumental figure that gave hint to what was to come. Lister's diaries not only give us a glimpse of her everyday life and love, but also a detailed look at her feelings about others and also about herself. Throughout Lister's diaries, readers are able to witness her struggles with gender identity and her lack of comfort that she felt in regard to her body. She writes frustratedly about a woman and how she, quote, considers me too much as a woman, but writes with appreciation to another lover, Mariana, and does not mention her menstrual napkins and avoids touching them. Lister also confides in Mariana about the discomfort that she feels regarding her gender, as Lister tells her about her, quote, sensitiveness of anything that reminded me of my petticoats. Lister is expressing her discomfort with her body and the constraints that society places onto what being a conventional woman must look and act like. She is not comfortable with these conventions and instead breaks from them. Her expression of her discomfort allows readers to see another side of Lister, as she can be viewed from a lens of lesbian studies, but also from trans studies. Lister again proves to be a foundational figure for LGBTQIA readers and can educate individuals on the importance of breaking binaries and gender norms. Due to Lister's masculine appearance and sexuality, she was given the derogatory name of Gentleman Jack during her lifetime. It is important to understand the history behind this term, as what a modern society may deem acceptable differs from the 18th and 19th definition of the term Jack. The term Jack whore can be defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as a female prostitute of large build, masculine appearance, or masculine characteristics. The 1756 definition in the OED indicates that this term is associated with masculinity but ascribed to a female prostitute. Additionally, the 1899 definition for the OED defines the term Jack as a venereal disease. Therefore, when Lister is called a Jack, that indicates that the one stating this is calling her either a female prostitute who is masculine or equating her with that of a sexually transmitted disease, both of which Lister was not, indicating that this is said to her in a derogatory manner. Both of these definitions stem from the 18th and 19th century usage, but sadly the term is still following her today. The title of the TV series Gentleman Jack, that is all about Lister, is oddly titled using the word Jack. Whether this is done as a reclamation or not is unclear, but it is important to note as it has stuck alongside her throughout centuries. The show's theme song sings, "Behind her back she's Gentleman Jack. Nobody likes a Jack the Lass," showing the inclusion of this term, but also another line exclaiming that no one likes a Jack. This song shows the importance in understanding the 18th and 19th century language and society in order to fully understand Lister and her current relevance in our society today. In conclusion, the language changing highlights the continued constraints put onto her by society and especially by men in her society. Later in 1816, Lister shows more of her impact on modern lesbian society as she writes more in depth about her relationship with Anne Walker. The ways in which the two women care for, express feelings, desire, and love one another shows the acknowledgement that modern-day lesbianism has and is still to be treated as a conventional relationship. Friday, 29th November, Halifax. A long prose just before getting into bed. Talked of the abuse I had had for romance, enthusiasm, flattery, manners of those of a gentleman, being too particularly attentive to the ladies, that in consequence I had resolved to change, and had succeeded in becoming much more cool and cautious in my general intercourse with people, and much less lavish for cordiality and civility. I asked her if, after all this, their lovemaking, she would own being in love with me. She said no. She did not like the term, but clasped me in her arms. We kissed and fell asleep. Lister is describing her anxieties around being a lesbian woman and her relationship. In this entry, she is sharing her anxieties about being too masculine, as she says, quote, "manners like those of a gentleman," which show a direct connection to breaking conventional characterizations ascribed to women and relates to her bodily discomfort mentioned previously. Lister's self-criticism of herself that are like a gentleman again connects to how society may cast lesbians to not behaving feminine enough. Lister expresses herself as having manners or characteristics that are manly, which would be considered unconventional, especially during her time. She also discusses how she is guilty of paying too much attention to women, showing her being possibly hypersexual or hyperromantic, which is a connection to the studies of sexuality, asexuality, romance, or aromance. Her expression of desire and her anxieties show exactly how she is able to be connected to our modern ideal of lesbianism and how she is a figure to grab onto as an LGBTQIA+ individual in the world needing guidance, support, and identity validation. Throughout her life, Lister faced many challenges that LGBTQIA+ individuals can relate to. Lister dealt with individuals around her diminishing her sexuality and also making a mockery of it. Lister and Anne Walker got married, despite it not being legally recognized, and it was just as legitimate as if it were legal. In the 18th and 19th centuries, this was illegal, and it seems that the word had slipped out about the act. On January 10th, 1835, in the Leeds Mercury newspaper, under the married section, someone had anonymously made a mocking announcement stating that, quote, "same day at the parish church, Halifax, Captain Tom Lister of Shibden Hall, near Halifax, to Miss Anne Walker, late of Lydgate, near the same place." Rather than this being a legitimate congratulating gesture, it was instead done to make a mockery out of their lesbian marriage. The newspaper entry gestures that Lister's father married Miss Walker, ultimately making it clear that 18th and 19th society believed that a man must be who is marrying the woman. BBC's Rebecca Wood's article, "The Life and Loves of Anne Lister," unpacks the marriage and mockery and states the scandal was soon the talk of Yorkshire. Anne Lister, who had been mocked for looking like a man for so many years, was now very much acting like one. Lister's society confined her as societal gender roles entailed that if someone is marrying a woman, they must be a man, prescribing individuals to heterosexuality, which is exactly what the entry is doing. Lister's relationship is not taken seriously and is not given the same respect in society that a heterosexual one would have received. This reveals to readers that Anne Lister's life and story is of so much value to contemporary sexuality studies as she endured so much pushback and continued to live her truth. As the mocking newspaper entry addressed Lister's father rather than herself, as if it was not enough, it unfortunately did not stop there. 2 days after the entry in the Leeds Mercury, Lister received an anonymous letter that was directed to Captain Lister, containing from the Leeds Mercury and concluding, "We beg to congratulate the parties on their happy connection." Probably meant to annoy, but if so, a failure, she wrote in her diary. Lister's diary entry highlights another attempt to poke illegitimacy at her and Walker's marriage. Lister acknowledges the fact that the anonymous letter was probably sent to annoy her, but she does not let it do so. Lister chooses to not let herself be affected by the injustice of her society and instead continues to be herself. In the series Gentleman Jack, the marriage entry is received by Lister as her father shows it to her, and she immediately questions who has seen this and if Miss Walker had seen it. She then speculates about who could have sent it. Then her father proceeds to tell her that if she did not draw attention to how odd she was, they would not do these things. Lister chooses to ignore his statement and then states that he better get out of bed and get some fresh air. This scene shows her family's own thoughts on her sexuality and how her own father describes her as odd. The jargon used to describe Lister's sexuality is not accepting and instead treating her as if she is not normal, which is what society for time did as well and what our current society still does. Lister again proves to be a monumental figure that queer folks can find themselves in, and she provides a way for individuals to see beyond societal constraints and negativity. Lister not only achieves having a same-sex marriage while it was illegal, but she also breaks gender roles and performativity of what a conventional husband or wife is. In, quote, "I Feel the Mind Enlarging Itself," and Lister's gendered reading practices, Charlie Matthews unpacks the ways in which Lister breaks gender roles and constructs. Matthew quotes other supporting texts and writes, "The first person to undertake serious examination of Lister's social gender practices was Jack Halberstam. Halberstam argues that Lister's masculinity is not simply representative of the same-sex desire, but instead suggests an active and functional but pre-identitarian female masculinity embedded within a highly ritualized marriage culture and struggling with the active cultural biases against female masculine expression. This engendered lens stops short of naming Lister trans, instead mobilizing a queer methodology that treats gender practices as historically specific. Halberstam names Lister a female husband. This phrase was a popular trope in the 19th century, but also a slippery one. Lister first is shown to prove that as a female, one is able to still be masculine and that her masculinity is not prescribed to her gender or sexuality, but just a making of Lister. Additionally, Lister is being described as a female husband proves that she is breaking the conventions of what a husband is, and instead proving that there is no sex or gender tied to being a husband. Husbandry is caring for, providing for, and or being there for your beloved and should not have a specific gender or sex tied to it. Lister proves that one can be female and be masculine, a husband, and not have to be confined to the conventional societal standards. Lister proves that lesbianism is a valid identity that must be taken seriously. It must be given the same rights as heterosexuality as she demonstrated her longing for happiness over liberty in a society that oppressed her due to her desires for women. She proved that women loving women should have equal marriage rights, that women's desires should be heard, and that there are a lot of anxieties around sexuality and gender expression. She proves herself to be a monument of lesbianism that lesbians today can find a community with. In conclusion, Lister must be studied as she serves as a path paper for what has progressed into our contemporary society in terms of queerness, gender, and sexuality.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. And yeah. So we give you a hand
Thank you.
and we will have the discussion towards the end. Can we move on to the next? Apala, would you like to read yours now? Apala?
Sure. Thank you so much for this opportunity from Melow.
Please introduce yourself and read your paper.
Yes. So I'm a final year PhD candidate at the University of Pittsburgh in the Department of English. I primarily work in the literature concentration, and I work with post-colonial mobilities in Indian Ocean novels. I'm also acquiring a master's certificate in gender, sexuality, and women's studies in addition to my PhD. So I will be switching my video off because I'm reading on the same screen. But yeah, my audio will remain open. So resisting erasure of women through queer love, queering the Indian Ocean. The island nation of Mauritius, considered a small island on its own in terms of the criterion of size, is part of the larger Mascarenes archipelago in the Western Indian Ocean, which also includes the islands of Reunion and Rodrigues. Since the archipelago, quote, had not been settled before Europeans arrived in the region from the 17th century onwards, unquote, the human history of Mauritius is a complex one of colonial settlement linked chiefly to successive colonizations by the Dutch, French, and the British. Slavery and indenture are the two enduring legacies of Mauritian history, political, legal, and socioeconomic structures of human mobility that spelled oppression, exploitation, discrimination, and marginalization while they were in practice during the colonial era, but whose ongoing and persistent aftermaths continue to be felt, experienced, and lived in contemporary, independent, post-colonial Mauritius. What is interesting, however, as authors of the introduction to the text Women in the Making of Mauritian History, published in 2021, point out, is that Mauritian women's intersectional experience of these systems of oppression, discrimination, and exclusion, including the violence and abuse unleashed by their practice, both in the past and in the present, have largely been overlooked in Mauritian history and historiography, especially the voices of African and Malagasy descent in Mauritius. Over the years, Mauritian literature, especially literary works by female Mauritian authors, have sought to represent and amplify these othered voices, the voices of, quote, often unseen, unheard Mauritian women, unquote. Franco-Mauritian author Ananda Devi's Eve Out of Her Ruins is one such literary work which holds up a picture of the realities of gender inequality and gender oppression in contemporary Mauritius through the eyes and the voice of the eponymous female protagonist Eve. To the world, tropical Mauritius is, quote, the island of gilded coastlines, hotels like royal palaces, luxury shops, and dreamlike villas, unquote, from Eve Out of Her Ruins, page 3. But hidden in the shadow of this island, quote, is another island, unquote, that Davy describes, quote, an island of dryness and drabness, neighborhoods bereft of hope, areas nobody dares go to, unquote, areas populated by what Mauritians call population generale, quote, neither this nor that, neither black nor white, neither Creole nor Hindu, unquote. In other words, these are the descendants of the historically marginalized, disenfranchised, oppressed groups in Mauritian society, communities whose individuals remain trapped in the shackles of poverty, powerlessness, exploitation, and abuse, forged, perpetuated, and sustained by the neocolonial ruling elite that has replaced the colonizers' rule of power. And even within this doomed community, the lowest rungs of the social ladder are reserved for its women, is the argument that Devi makes. Eve, a young 17-year-old Maroon girl, Maroon was the term used for slaves who self-liberated generally through flight or fugitivity, and Eve is one of this population, a resident of one such, albeit fictional neighborhood of despair, Tromaron. Davies' novel becomes a vehicle for Eve's voice, not merely because it has Eve as the protagonist telling her story herself, but in terms of its novelistic structure as well. It is worth noting at the outset that the novel is presented in the form of brief monologues divided across 4 speakers, 2 young teenager boys, Saad and Clelio, and 2 young teenager girls, Eve and Savita, all from the same impoverished neighborhood. But Eve is clearly the central speaker, as Devi has the most number of monologues, 18 in total attributed to her, as well as several pages worth of subconscious monologues from her as well. Readers are introduced to an Eve already stripped of her humanity, as the novel will go on to show, due to repeated relentless infliction of violence, abuse, and oppression. She introduces herself as a monster, an animal. Quote, with each step, a monster rises, fully formed. When I saw myself in the mirror, I saw that I had a lioness's head. I had a mane of hunger, unquote. This violence, this dehumanization is primarily gendered, sexual, and as the novel reveals, generational. The women of the community had historically been subjected to, quote, all kinds of abuse at the hands of slave owners, plantation owners, administrators, and spouses or partners, unquote. In one of his monologues, the character of Clelio describes this cycle, underlining its link to Mauritius's colonial past in the following words, quote, the song's saying, the mother sleeps with her eyes open, and the mother is the father's slave, and the father is the boss's slave, and the mother, therefore, is the slave of another slave. And it's worse than everything. How can anyone fight for the slave of another slave? Unquote. Elsewhere in the novel, Eve describes the domestic violence endured by her mother at the hands of her alcoholic father. But for the most part, readers are forced to contend with the brutality and abuse that Eve is herself prey to on a daily basis. At home, her father is described as a potential sexual predator. Quote, one night he came into my room. I pretended to sleep. He watched me. He stayed a long while. I don't know what he was thinking about, what was going through his head. Is he still a father? Am I still his child? What would I know? Unquote. At school, education that could potentially help her escape from this hellhole and achieve her own dreams of selfhood and dignity had to be bartered for using sexual currency. Quote, the teacher looks at me with a gritted smile. He's nice to me, but shifty. I know he pays attention to the slightest changes in my eyes, my voice, my silence. Open the smallest gap, and he'll plunge right in. I see him coming, and I wait. I need tutoring for my tests. He'll do it, unquote. And she's generally aware that she's not safe anywhere, at any time, in the community at large. This relentless assault on her selfhood, on her identity, and her personhood obviously takes a toll on Eve. One of her subconscious monologue reads, quote, shadow or wing, what you were no longer is. You become something else. You watch as you sink, but you don't see that it's you. One day you'll see yourself in the mirror and nothing at all will be yours. You ask yourself where you went, unquote. However, in this prolonged cycle of sexual power games that Eve is caught up in, she is adamant that she's not the victim nor the prey. Rather, in performing a psychological dissociation on her own self, the clear distinction she draws between her soul and her body, she claims agency over herself, presents herself as the aggressor, as the predator. Her defiance, her refusal to admit quiet surrender to the onslaught of violence she negotiates every day, is clearly palpable in her words. Quote, I'm 17 years old and I don't give a fuck. I'm buying my future. This skeleton has a secret life sealed in its belly. It's carved by the sharp edge of refusal. They are the ones who fear me, who fear what they can only guess lies beneath the skin. Whatever changes in me, it's not the truest, innermost part of myself. I protect myself. I know how to protect myself from men. I'm the predator here. They take me, they bring me back. Sometimes they rough me up. No matter. It's just a body. It can be fixed. That's what it's for. Unquote. In her tenacious fight for selfhood, her battle against invisibility and erasure, Devi holds Eve steady by offering her one other form of arsenal. There is one other factor that holds Eve back from the brink of self-disintegration or fracture, even in the face of unabating degradation. It is the relationship, the bond between Eve and her friend Savita, what both Devi and Eve describe as, quote, the poetry of women. Savita's family was also from Trumarone, trapped in the ravages of poverty, though, as Savita puts it, in denial of their reality. Quote, we lived in Trumarone as escapees, as refugees among refugees, living there while insisting on being somewhere else, something else, refusing to accept the signs that we were no different from all the others, at odds with ourselves, unquote. Despite their families being against each other, the connect between them was instantaneous from the moment they met each other at school. and I'm naming this affect shared between the two women queer love. Of their first meeting, Eve recalls, quote, "She wiped my brow, then she leaned over and kissed me. Outside the purview of men, we became happy, playful for a few minutes. We were smiling like drowned souls finally at peace. We danced on a tightrope that stretched from her heart to mine." Unquote. Over time, their relationship deepens and strengthens. I argue that the queer character of their relationship must be understood as more than just Michael Warner and David M. Halperin's definition of queer as, quote, resistance to the norm, the normal, or heteronormativity, unquote. For Eve and Savita, their queer love was not a means to position themselves as lesbians or lay claims to homosexual identities that resisted the norm of heterosexuality. It was not a passive stance of resistance rooted in the reductive binary of heterosexuality and homosexuality. Rather, the queer character of their love must be read in the way that Janet Jacobson defines queer, as a, quote, verb, a particular type of action, if as an identity at all, then as an identity of doing rather than being, unquote. Jacobson argues that queer needs to be considered as a, quote, position of identificatory practice, that is, as a site where a particular set of practices of resistance can be enacted, unquote, where focus should not be too much on the site itself, but also on the practices or actions themselves. The love shared between Eve and Savita lives up to Janet Jacobson's conceptualization of queer, in that their relationship is an act of active queering, where resistance is demonstrated in the very embodied and agential acts and performances of loving, and this resistance is aimed at challenging or undoing the larger normalized and normalizing structures and networks of gendered and sexual abuse and violence that plagues contemporary Mauritian society. The bond between the two was a living, tangible phenomenon, evident to anyone who knew them. Unquote. The two girls' eyes meet and lock on one another. There's a smile so vague and discreet that you'd have to be looking for it. This smile between the two of them, bronze eyes meeting black, a quiver of light that disappears before it starts to gleam, almost a shared rivulet linking their lips. The smile is a doorway toward a place only the two of them know. Just between girls. We sparring cocks wouldn't know anything about it. Unquote. And yet, it was exclusive and exclusionary. In the embodied practice and performance of their queer love, Eve and Savita actively resist the structures of gendered and sexual violence, inequality, and oppression that seek to erase their very human existence, that strip them of their humanity and reduce them to mere sexual objects to be played with, tossed aside, or broken at the whims or convenience of the master players of the game. Their queer love aroused them to resist this erasure, this invisibility that is forced upon them, and allows them to reclaim their humanity. They see each other, they hear each other. Quote, Savita and I have fun dreaming of other selves, born in good places, into families where defeat can't be read in palm lines or bent knees. We'd be doctors or lawyers, and we'd care for and defend the weak and the poor. Savita tickles my toes. I licked the soles of her feet. We have the same skin, completely smooth, into which our hands disappear. When we rub these spots, time stops. I lay my head on her stomach and I hear the sounds of her organs. We don't really need to talk. We know how to listen to her silences. Unquote. The resistance that Eve and Savita practiced through their queer love thus becomes synonymous to survival. It is not surprising, then, that when Eve is confronted with Saad's love for her, she responds to it by saying, "The day I say I love you to a man, I'll kill myself." But when it comes to Savita, she's the only thing keeping Eve alive. The resistance born within the queer love between Eve and Savita does not serve to uphold any binaristic opposition between heterosexual and homosexual forms of love and desire. That the island of Mauritius offers up the space for this queer love between Eve and Savita to unfold is then perhaps not surprising. Rather, the potential for such love seems inherent in the very geophysicality of the island. The etymology of island invokes the requisite relationship of land to water. Elaborating on this, Julian Beer writes that, quote, the concept island implies a particular and intense relationship of land and water, unquote. The Oxford English Dictionary describes the word as a pun that yokes together both elements. Isle in its earliest forms derived from a word for water and means watery or water. In Old English land was added to it to make it a compound, island, water-surrounded land. Both elements being intrinsic to the word are thus set in play. Given that the constitution of the island is made possible not so much by focusing on any one element in binaristic hierarchical opposition to the other, but through the notion of ambiguous borders in play, it makes sense that Mauritius would be able to carve out a space for the queer love between Eve and Savita to flourish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Apala. You've taken us to Mauritius, and that's something that the other delegates were not able to. That's one region where the other delegates did not go. I'm so glad that you opened up another dimension. So we'll come back to your paper later, and let's move on now. Samrat, would you like to read yours? Huh? You get what? Yes, Samrat, it's good to see you again. You've been missing for a while.
Yes, I just had my comprehensive exam, and then I'm
Yes,
defending
I
my
know.
dissertation proposal
Yes,
in
yes.
about 2 weeks.
Wonderful.
So there's a lot going on over there.
So just
But
introduce yourself briefly because the others don't know you.
yes. Hi, everyone. I am Samrat Sharma. I am a dual title PhD scholar, which means I've been getting PhD from 2 departments, that is education and women, gender, and sexuality studies. This paper that I'm presenting, the visibility as regulation, shifting terrain of Hijra, Kinnar, and trans identities in contemporary India, is part of the larger thesis project that I'm developing, which is around developing a Hijra pedagogy based on gossip and cussing in India as a way of negotiating power within the the Hijra community in New Delhi. All right, so I'll start my paper. Would you have prefer if I share slides or just read out the paper?
Whatever you would like, Samrat.
All right, I'll just start reading the paper.
If you
Right.
have slides that we would be interested in seeing, why don't you do that
Right.
also? Huh?
Okay, give me 1 second.
So let me give you hosting rights. Samrat, where are you, Samrat? Here. Okay, I made you the co-host, so you can show your slides now. Huh? Incidentally, Samrat and I were colleagues some years ago. And that time he was doing his PhD from Delhi University, but then he moved on to the US, and he's doing very well there. Yeah, great.
All right, is everyone able to see my screen?
Yes, we are.
All right, perfect. All right, so hey, this paper examines how the categories of hijras are gender non-conforming groups in India with their own histories, culture, and practices, right? So this paper examines how the categories of hijra, trans, and kinner reveal a shifting regimes of regulation and recognition in contemporary India. Rather than assuming visibility as progress, I trace how each term emerges within distinct genealogies of caste, religion, colonial governance, neoliberal development, and Hindu nationalism. Foundational scholarship on Hijra disrupt universalizing third gender framing, while the rise of NGO-driven trans identities and the Sanskritized majoritarian figure of the Kinnar illustrate how gender variance becomes differentially legible to the state. Across these shifts, I notice and highlight how gender is criminalized, celebrated, or weaponized depending on the political terrain. Right. Since the 1980s, the figure of the Hijra has become subject of an increasing interest in academia, particularly the West. Although not a lot of work has been produced, Some key texts by Nanda, Reddy, Sarya, and Datta have kind of shaped how hijras are discussed. Hijras have often been approached less as a complex social formation and more as objects of difference that either support or challenge the Western gender theory. This kind of flattening overlooks how hijra lives are embedded within rituals, social practices, caste hierarchies, and kinship systems, and it transforms them into this universal trans or third gender figure. This universal framing, however, is challenged a lot by Nanda and Reddy, which I shall now discuss. Nanda defines hijras as a religious community of men who dress and act like women and whose culture centers on the worship of Bahuchara Mata, a goddess associated with chastity and fertility. Nanda also foregrounds nirvana or emasculation, the removal of penis and testicles without vaginal reconstruction, as central to hijra identity, and describes hijra as neither man nor women, occupying a very institutionalized third gender role in India, and which we also saw in the Nalsa judgment in 2014, where the Supreme Court said India now has a third gender. This neither nor framing appears to challenge gender binary, but I argue that it actually reaffirms it. Hijras are still defined only in relation to men and women. The third gender, rather than opening genuine multiplicity, it becomes a symbolic category that often manages and contains the difference of gender. Drawing on Derrida's concept of supplementarity, I argue that hijras as third gender functions as a supplement that fills the perceived void in the binary while ultimately securing it. This positions hijras not as an exception, but something that stabilizes the binary of man-woman instead of disrupting it. Reddy, on the other hand, in 2005, reworks this framing. She defines hijras as phenotypic men who wear female clothing and idly renounce sexual desire. And they do this by undergoing nirvana or emasculation, and they dedicate it to Bedraj Mata, just the same name, Bahuchara Mata and Bedraj Mata. They're the same goddess, but with different names in different parts of the country. But she refuses to treat hijras as this very monolithic sort of a third gender identity. Instead, she emphasizes that hijra identities must be articulated through a multiplicity of morally evaluated differences, especially in terms of authenticity, respectability, or izzat. These differences create internal hierarchies within the hijra community that disrupt any singular understanding of the community itself. For Reddy, hijras are not simply sexual identities, but they are produced through intersecting axes of renunciation, birth, desire, economy, and respectability. Both Nanda and Reddy attend closely to hijra kinship and relationship. Nanda describes deras or hijra households as residential and economic units that are headed by a guru, that is a teacher or a leader, and populated by chelas, the disciples, across several generations. The feminine relational terms such as grandmother, mother, aunt, daughter, and sister are used to organize kinship within the hijra community, and each house is linked to a larger gharana or a method school. So in India, there are about 7 gharanas and it depends on which part of the country you are. So Delhi has 2 main gharanas, and like Hyderabad has 2 other gharanas which are not there in Delhi. Reddy complicates this by tracing how hijra identity is entangled within the Koti-Panti relationship, which are both hijra identities, kind of referencing to masculine and feminine roles. And by showing that how hijra subjectivity is not simply reducible to acting like women, but it is defined through sexual roles, gendered acts, and hierarchies of authenticity and respectability. Religion and asceticism also play a very important role. For Nanda, emasculation is the major source of the ritual power of the hijras, and nirvana functions as a symbolic rebirth that aligns hijra with the figure of the renouncer or the sannyasi. Reddy extends this by situating hijras within the tension between the grihastha or the householder and the sannyasi and the renouncer. So the 4 stages of the ashrama in the Indian life, that's where we see with the two figures, which we have, the Grihastha and the Sannyasi. That's where the hijras lies somewhere in the middle of that. She draws on the ideas developed by Dumont to show how individuality in India, Hindu India, emerges through otherworldly renunciation. Yet, as Reddy notes, there are many hijras who also engage in sex work. So, asceticism and sex work are not simply opposite, they kind of coexist in tension. Desire is not extinguished but transformed and reoriented. And many hijras who age, they might move away from sex work to badhai, which is a ritual blessing, but what they do is they transform this desire that they carry or the erotics into storytelling, memory, as well as ritual authority. Occupation becomes another axis through which hijra identity is negotiated. There are three main occupations, which is badhai, ritual blessing, begging, and third is sex work. The main professions are is badhai, and badhai is kind of reserved for those who have already undergone nirvan, and they're closely tied to fertility and izzat. So whenever there is a birth of a child or there is a new marriage into the house, in the house, so hijras are invited into the house to bless the couple, right? Um, Sex work, by contrast, creates tension with the mythic imagination of the hijra body, and yet how both Reddy and Saria show that it is a crucial site where desire, masculinity, and the economy of semen are managed and negotiated. By economy of semen, I mean that within the Hindu mythology, semen is a very important sort of a category where, like the sannyasis would do a lot of tapasya to kind of hold on to the semen, and because after the tapasya, the release of the semen has creative energies. Right? Begging, on the other hand, falls to the novices or older hijras, or sometimes who are pushed out of the ritual and the sexual economies. It is relatively like there is this almost this neglect in the scholarship around begging, which kind of hints at the discomfort while centering caste and colorism while discussing hijra communities, because the hijras who are more fair in their skin color, they're sent to ritual blessings and sex work, while uh, uh, like the community members who are darker in color, they're sent to begging. Finally, Hijra lives have also been shaped by British colonial understandings. Jessica Hinchy in 2019 show how hijras were framed through the language of contagion, pollution, and disorder, especially under the Contagious Disease Act of 1868. The British sought to the erasure of public appearances of hijras as part of a broader project of social inquiry, medicalization, and moral regulation. This combined with the emerging Indian middle class respectability politics, and this contributed to what Joshu calls the slow death of hijras in the public life, not through direct extermination, but through sustained legal, medical, and cultural erasure. Taken together, these debates suggest that hijras are not simply third gender or a local version of the westernized trans identity. They are a gender non-conforming community whose identities and labels are produced at the intersection of religion, asceticism, kinship, occupation, caste, and colonial regulation. In tracing the rise of the transgender identity as a state-recognized and NGO-legible category in South Asia, we see how hijra bodies have been reframed, and they've been taken away from the irrational or socially useless to reformable citizens, and finally to symbols mobilized within the right-wing nationalist discourse, which I will deal in the next section of the paper. The shift shows how queerness and transness have both been criminalized and instrumentalized depending on the political moment. It marks a moment from what Judith Butler calls the precarious lives, like the shift from precarious lives to state-defined classifications such as third gender, made possible through neoliberal governance, NGOization, and emergence of the new governable trans subject. Under neoliberalism, Brown argues that citizenship is reconfigured through market rationalities that prioritize individualism. This logic not only determines which forms of labor appear valuable, but also which forms of gender also become intelligible. Communal and ritual forms of labor, such as badhai, they become illegible and even antithetical to neoliberal logics. In Bangladesh, we see this as well, where Hussein shows that how the developmental discourse reframed hijras as sexually and genetically disabled subjects in the need of rescue. This pathologization kind of echoes the British medico-legal frameworks where public hijra lives was targeted for erasure. By casting badhai and begging as criminalized anti-developmental activities, the state attacks the embodied practices rather than bodies themselves. And therefore, they kind of strip away the cultural legitimacy of the hijra community and produce useful citizens. In India, Liz Mount shows how the NGO frameworks kind of expanded the gender categories, while also they kind of rigidified them as categories, where certain gender groups were identified as at-risk subgroups for targeted funding. The state drew on this vocabulary to consolidate gender non-conforming people under the third gender, producing the trans identity aligned with the biopolitical care and management. Datta also names this process as vernacularization, where regionally embedded identities such as Kothi and Hijras were reframed as local variants of global transgender discourse, rendering them legible yet stripped of any form of local context. Through this process, respectability also becomes redefined. So the kind of respectability that the Hijra community had with nirvana and emasculation, that becomes attached more to English-speaking, educated trans subjects, opening the door for Hindutva to selectively appropriate certain gender non-conforming figures into nationalist projects. Earlier 20th century marks a striking shift in Hindu rights approach to gender and sexuality. In late 1990s, Hindutva organizations framed LGBTQ people as Western imports, which were morally corrupt, culturally dangerous, and antithetical to Indian values. However, by late 2000s, as the Hindu right embraced neoliberalism and developmentalism, it simultaneously adopted a strategy of conditional inclusion. Datta shows how this inclusion selectively incorporates dominant upper caste Hindu and politically aligned LGBTQ individuals while continuing to marginalize Muslim and other minorities. Rather than a contradiction, the selective recognition reflects a broader Hindutva strategy. Only those queer and trans subjects who align with the nationalist values become legible and governable. This is in line with what Brown earlier said about the neoliberal governance. Within this terrain, the Kinnar identity emerges as a strategically palatable category. Kinnar, a Sanskritized term popularized by the right-wing discourse, reframes Hijra subjectivity through a Hindu majoritarian lens. The Kinnar is cast not as a figure rooted in mixed Hindu-Muslim spiritual lineages that we see in Nanda and Reddy, but as a saffron-clad, proud Hindu devotee. In this discourse, what happens is the Bahuchara Mata is replaced by Bharat Mata, or Mother India. A ritual power becomes nationalist symbolism. Kinnar identity gains visibility not by queering dominant norms, but by conforming to the religious iconography and nationalist script. This shift is evident in public performances where Hijras dressed in devotional garb deployed violent curse words towards Pakistan. And this is a video on Instagram which went popular in May 2025. Hussein also notes that Hijra communities have long used verbal insults as a tactic to reclaim space denied to them in public. Yet, the intent differs because the Hijras use cursing historically kind of unsettles the heteropatriarchal and sexual boundaries. The Kinnars, on the other hand, they use cursing to assert patriotic belonging, demonstrating loyalty to the nation. This dynamic resonates with what Puar calls homo nationalism, where minority rights are co-opted by the state to kind of use them for national building project. Nishant Upadhyay kind of extend this analysis to India by suggesting homo nationalism, where he shows that how legal recognition, such as the Nalsa judgment of 2014 and the 2018 decriminalization decisions, were shaped by Brahminical supremacy and Islamophobia rather than decolonial impulses. Through what Upadhyay calls the Homo-Hindu nationalism, queer inclusion becomes tethered to Hindu majoritarianism. In this framework, Kinner is not the figure of subversion, but the figure of national unity, rendered recognizable precisely through compliance with caste, religion, and gender norms. Taken together, the discussion of Hijra, trans, and Kinner identities reveal not a linear narrative of progress, but a very uneven terrain shaped by caste, governance, and colonial residues. Across these formations, what becomes clear is that gender variance in South Asia is never experienced or recognized uniformly. Instead, each category is produced within distinct logics of legibility. The hijras are read through ritual, kinship, caste, and colonial criminalization. The trans identities are molded through NGO vocabularies and developmental paradigms and neoliberal respectability. And the Kinners emerge as this Hindu nationalist reinterpretation of the hijra life worlds. This uneven allows us to kind of map the same bodies that can be rendered illegible, celebrated, or weaponized depending on the political script. Hijras become unintelligible when framed through ritual access or colonial disorder. Trans subjects become governable when reframed through medicalized risk, rescue, and documentation. And the Kinners finally become hyperphysical when they align with majoritarian nationalism. Across these shifts, the terrain is structured less by gender and more by which forms of gender nonconformity can be made useful to the state. Thus, uneven terrain helps us name how these categories operate simultaneously as sites of dispossession and incorporation, precarity and utility, stigma and symbolic capital, thereby revealing that visibility is always contingent, stratified, and politically orchestrated. To conclude, across Hijras, trans, and Kinner formations, visibility does not signal liberation, but a differential incorporation into state and nationalist projects. Hijras remain marked by ritual and colonial anxieties, and trans and Kinner identities are tied to how someone can be either rescued or incorporated into the national script. Together, these trajectories reveal that gender variance is never uniform. They are produced through uneven terrains that privilege certain subjects while rendering others expendable, illegible, or disposable. Thank you.
Thank you, Samrat. That was fascinating. We can see the passion that you have for the subject that you've been working on lately. And we can also see how deeply engrossed you are in it. We look forward to having your full paper. I'm sure it will make a very interesting read. We move on to the last speaker of this session, and that is Gonul Bakay. Gonul is from Turkey. And Gonul, will you introduce yourself briefly before you read your paper?
I am Gonul Bakay from Bahçeşehir University, Istanbul, and I am still teaching part-time in Bahçeşehir University. And now my paper is on queer space, shame, and the limits of Englishness. Ian Foster's Morris. Ian Foster's Morris represents an intervention into the moral, legal, and cultural frameworks of early 20th century England by insisting upon the legitimacy of homosexual love in a context where such recognition was deemed impossible. Written during a period when male same-sex desire was criminalized, the novel imagines a world in which two men might not only love each other, but also remain together, unashamed and unpunished. Foster referred to homosexuality as part of, quote, a great unrecorded history, unquote, and Morris attempted to inscribe this history into fiction, not through tragedy, but through an act of utopian imagining that refuses the punitive logic of the society surrounding it. The narrative traces the psychological and emotional development of Maurice Hall, who moves from the certainties of suburban middle class to a hard-won comprehension of his own nature. Maurice's formation occurs within the institutions that shape and police English masculinity. the public school, Cambridge University, the suburban family home, and the class-segregated country estate. Each environment is saturated with the expectation of heterosexuality, not merely as a norm, but as the structural foundation of Englishness, propriety, and social continuation. Morris's first significant encounter with the possibility of same-sex love occurs at Cambridge, when he befriends Clive Durham. As Angela Toda points out, quote, one crucial way in which Morris is essentially Edwardian is his concern with the effects of public school education, as it affects the conceptualization of relations between men, unquote. In this context, Cambridge provides a liminal space in which homosocial and homosexual desire blur, not because of the institution is somewhat tolerant, but because its male-dominated intellectual intimacy provides cover for effects that cannot rise to the level of open declaration. Quote, if Morris is taken as an Edwardian defense of the ethical validity of fully sexual relationships between men, a central element in this defense is Foster's rejection of the ambivalent discourse of public school ideology as regards these bonds, unquote. Clive's confession of love disrupts this fragile ambiguity, provoking Morris's immediate retreat into the defensive reflexes of English respectability. Quote, you are an Englishman, I am another. It is the only subject absolutely beyond limit, unquote. His response embodies the nation's script of shame to which Eva Kozowski-Sedgwick draws attention when she observes that shame and identity remain in a complex dynamic relation, at once deconstituting and foundational, from Epistemology of the Closet. The intimacy between Morris and Clive deepens through gestures and proximity rather than explicit acknowledgement. Foster's skill in reproducing desire through tableau, through the charged description of bodies, touching lightly, avoiding speech, or withdrawing suddenly when a third party calls, translates unspeakable desire into visual effective form. Religion further complicates the psychological landscape of both characters. Clive begins the novel as an atheist, neglecting church attendance, yet after renouncing his homosexual desires and committing himself to the path of heterosexual marriage, he returns to Christianity with renewed fervor. Morris, by contrast, becomes increasingly alienated from religious doctrine as he grows closer to Clive. The novel therefore suggests that Christian morality and social respectability are intertwined, and that Clive's retreat into heterosexuality is facilitated, if not demanded, by the reactivation of religious belief. So Foster portrays Christianity not as a domain of spiritual freedom, but as a doctrine that disciplines sexuality and legitimizes social conformity. Morris's conviction that his desire is a form of illness leads him to eventually seek medical treatment. Dr. Berry's inability to comprehend Morris's confession, reduced dismissively to, quote, an illness of the Oscar Wilde sort, unquote, illustrates the epistemic limits of the medical profession and the extent to which institutionalized authority upheld the regime of silence. Rather than offering psychological insight, Berry prescribes willful forgetting, the very mechanism through which society maintains the closet. Sedgwick's observation that even openly gay individuals often remain closeted with respect to someone, quote, personally, economically, or institutionally important to them, illuminates the logic of the scene. His visit to the hypnotist, Mr. Lesker Jones, on the other hand, marks a turning point. Lesker Jones does not pathologize Murder's desire, but instead confirms his permanence. Yet even this enlightened figure cannot provide the means of living openly in England. Instead, he recommends relocation to countries governed by the Napoleonic Code, where homosexual acts are no longer criminal. The suggestion of exile parallels the historical reality faced by many homosexual men in Foster's time. Morris's resistance to leaving England reveals the depth of his attachment to national belonging, even as the nation does not accept them. His insistence, quote, there have always been people like me, and always will be, unquote, signifies a refusal to accept erasure, even though the social order provides no space for him. Foster portrays Clive not as a villain, but as a product of class convention and the immense pressures of social expectation. His retreat into respectability is framed as tragic, but unsurprising. Morris, however, moves in another direction. Instead of suppressing his nature, he confronts it more directly, and in doing so becomes open to the possibility of a new form of intimacy. Consequently, Clive remains shrouded in self-denial and in his marriage, but Morris acknowledges his desires as an inescapable or ineradicable part of himself. His ability to invert the master narrative leads to greater self-understanding and union with Alec, Clive's lower-class gamekeeper. Morrison's relationship with Alex Scudder marks a decisive reorientation of the novel's emotional and political trajectory. Alec, a gamekeeper employed on Clive's estate, stands outside the intellectual and social environment that shaped Morrison's earlier experiences. Their encounter destabilizes not only the boundaries between classes, but also the broader ideological structures that define English masculinity. Foster presents this relationship as a challenge to received hierarchies. Morris, conditioned by upper middle class assumptions, initially regards Alec with suspicion. Alec, for his part, maintains the differential posture expected of working class men, addressing Morris as Mr. Hall, even in moments of emotional intimacy. Yet their growing attachment systematically undermines these ingrained habits. When Alec finally says, quote, "You called me Alec, I am as good as you," unquote, he articulates a claim not only to personal dignity, but an equal standing that transcends the rigidities of class stratification. This line illustrates Foster's belief that authentic emotional connection requires the dissolution of social hierarchy. In constructing the Morris-Alec relationship, Foster also critiques the English class system's role in policing emotional expression. Clive's earlier warning, quote, "You can't trust people from the lower class," unquote, reveals the ideological bias that frames the working class as morally suspect, impulsive, or dangerous. Morris initially endorses this suspicion, but Alec's sincerity and vulnerability gradually dismantle his inherent assumptions. Foster's attention to class difference intersects with his broader interrogation of the structures that regulate sexuality. The estate setting dramatizes this intersection. It is a site where English pastoral tradition, feudal hierarchy, and rigid gender norms converge. Yet it also becomes the location where these boundaries are breached. Alex's initial approach to Morris, an encounter in the boathouse, occurs in a liminal space at the edge of the estate, neither wholly private nor entirely public, symbolic of the precarious threshold between danger and possibility. Foster shows how queer desire emerges in the interstices of social systems that deny its legitimacy. The spatial geography of the novel is thus inseparable from its erotic geography. Desire takes root in the margins, where surveillance is weakest and the normative order loosest. A pivotal component of Morris's transformation involves the symbolic landscape of Greenwood. Foster does not present Greenwood as an escapist fantasy, but as a utopian counterspace, one that exists outside the jurisdiction of societal judgment. Greenwood represents a reimagining of the English pastoral tradition, reclaiming it from heteronormative mythology and reinvigorating it as a site of queer freedom. When Morris and Alec choose to leave society and live together in Greenwood, their decision asserts the possibility, however precarious, of a life beyond the reach of legal persecution and class oppression. As I have suggested throughout the novel possesses a profound critique of stifling social conventions, while also foregrounding the importance of seeking personal happiness and fulfillment. Quote, "Much of the validity of Morris derives from the fact that homosexual interests at the novel's center are not made into self-justifying ends, but rather are tied closely into three major concerns of Foster's thought. These are the belief in the vital importance of personal relationships, the critiques of the spiritual inadequacies of modern society, and the belief in the regenerative powers of nature. The motive of time is central to Foster's conception of queer possibility. The novel's engagement with psychology further complicates the question of identity. Morris's and Clive's family dynamics reflect contemporary psychoanalytic theories that linked homosexuality to overbearing maternal figures and absent fathers. Bowman's interpretation of Freud's theory that homosexual men pass through an intense but fleeting attachment to their mothers, later identifying with them and seeking themselves in other men, resonates faintly in the text. Though Foster does not endorse it explicitly, he incorporates such details not to pathologize his characters, but to show how psychological discourse of the era both attempted to explain and inadvertently reinforce the sense of deviance surrounding homosexual desire. As Bartley points out, quote, long before 20th century scholars recognized and anatomized the sexual significance of the male gaze as it had developed in fiction, as it would be developed in 20th century film, Foster perceived that significance and radically, subtly refigured the gaze to allow for a male other. Throughout the novel, Foster often conveys erotic tension through silent visual observation, employing that critics have described as the homoerotic tableau. The sleeping gamekeeper, bathed in sunlight, quote, embraced and penetrated by the sun, unquote. His body rendered, quote, delicate amber, stand as one of the novel's most explicit articulations of desire. Drawing on Lacan, he further suggests that Foster employs the tableau and the gaze to convey the intensity of Morris's desire as he struggles to come to terms with the suppressed homosexual nature. These tableaux, along with the museum scenes where Morris and Alec confront ancient heroic sculptures, articulate a lineage of male beauty that extends across time, connecting ancient representations of the male body to modern queer desire. Morris's dreams further reinforce this dynamic by offering a psychic space where forbidden desire briefly becomes visible, before shame reasserts its grip. In a recently published article, Maaz bin Bilal argues that Forrest Ray's presence in Foster's life shaped the novel, and his night of our novella, The Garden God, A Tale of Two Boys, directly informed many of Morris's central concerns: his character construction, key scenes, and recurrent imagery and symbolism, particularly in the novel's opening sections. According to bin Bilal, Foster uses Ray's imagery and symbolism for Morris's dream sequence, which reveal emotional truths that cannot be articulated in waking life. Morris's first dream envisions the ideal companion as a garden boy, a figure that unmistakably recalls Forrest Ray's The Garden God. The companion who appears in Merrill's second dream also closely parallels Ray's conception of the garden god. Foster's exploration of the closet aligned closely with the theoretical insights later articulated by Sedgwick in Epistemology of the Closet. According to Sedgwick, quote, in a male society, there is a spatial link between male homosocial, including homosexual, desire and the structures for maintaining and transmitting patriarchal power. For historical reasons, this spatial relationship may take the form of ideological homophobia, ideological homosexuality, or something conflicted, but is truly structural combination of the two. Although Foster wrote half a century earlier, the novel illustrates Sedgwick's argument that the closet functions as the central structuring principle of modern sexual identity. Morris lives in a society where homosexual acts are criminalized, but more profoundly, where homosexual identity is rendered unthinkable. The pressure to conceal desire is not simply a matter of legal risk. It arises from the entire fabric of cultural expectation. Sedgwick emphasizes the deadly elasticity of heterosexist presumption, observing that even when an individual comes out, new walls spring up around them. The legal framework surrounding homosexuality further reinforces this instability. Dr. Perry's response reveals the medical profession's complicity in maintaining moral and legal prohibitions, while Lesker Jones' advice to seek refuge in countries governed by the Code Napoleon exposes the limitations of English law. When Morris asks whether the law in England would ever change, Lesker Jones replies, I doubt it, foregrounding the despair that shows the narrative. Foster's emphasis on Englishness is especially striking given the critique of public school system and the cultivated ideal of manliness. Hartfree remarks that, quote, as an average middle-class man, Morris is necessarily the epitome of central version of Englishness. His struggle to formulate his identity as a homosexual is thus also the struggle to renegotiate the terms of his construction as an Englishman. The project of the novel as a whole then becomes the attempt to rework Englishness in order to make or even reclaim a space within it for homosexuality. At Hartfree further suggests public schools of that period generated intense, often homoerotic bonds, while disowning them. Manliness was publicly articulated as strictly heterosexual, centered on sport, discipline, and imperial virtue, even as the same institutions produce environments ripe for same-sex attraction. The contrast between Clive and Morris, therefore, also mark a contrast between two cultural models of homosexuality, the Platonic intellectual's ideal that disavows sexual fulfillment, and the modern recognition of erotic desire as integral to personal authority. Morris's embrace of physical love with Alec represents not a descent into sin, as Clive fears, but an ascent into truth. Their union becomes a corrective to the fragmentation that afflicts Morris throughout the first half of the novel. In loving Alec, body and soul, Morris achieves a synthesis of desire and selfhood that had previously eluded him. The critical reception among Foster's contemporaries illuminates the cultural tensions embedded in the novel. Ian Foster alive, Fairbank explains how Foster encountered a mixture of admiration and resistance when he circulated the manuscript privately. Little Strachey respected the novel, but doubted that a love like that between Morris and Alec could endure. His skepticism reflects a broader cultural assumption that homosexual relationships were inherently unstable, transient, or corrupting. Foster's choice to conclude the novel with Lover's Retreat into Greenwood directly challenges this assumption, insisting on the possibility of enduring queer love. His insistence upon a happy ending functions as both personal defiance and political intervention, an assertion that fiction can imagine what society prohibits. The novel engages deeply with the sexuality in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Foucault's later argument in the history of sexuality that it was not until the late 19th century that the concept of homosexuality as an orientation began to emerge in Western theoretical and medical discourse eliminates the historical moment depicted in Morris. Morris does not begin the novel thinking of himself as a homosexual. He thinks of himself as someone with an illness. Foster's depiction of Morris's confusion demonstrates the transnational nature of this period, when traditional moral frameworks had not fully given way to modern psychological ones, leaving individuals without a coherent narrative of identity. To conclude, what Morris ultimately offers is not a naive fantasy, but a disciplined act of imagination, a vision of what could exist once the machinery of social repression is dismantled. In the words of John Hart, quote, the forms of oppression in the novel are varied in structure and severity, but they are interconnected, one hierarchy legitimizing another by means of analogy. It follows that the numerous manifestations of privilege cannot be successfully challenged one at a time, but the attack must be directed against the entire system of stifling polarities. The ending of the novel reflects Morris's realization that homosexuality offers no fixed or predetermined identity. It is instead something he must construct for himself, drawing upon the insights he has gained about his own position and the shared conditions of other marginalized individuals. In granting Morris and Alec the possibility of a shared life outside the constraints of their world, Foster affirms the legitimacy of queer existence and asserts the enduring human capacity to imagine and experience new forms of belonging. The novel thus stands not as a personal testament, but as a radical reconfiguration of the ethical and emotional landscapes of modernity. Thank you.
Thank you, Gonul. That was a very detailed study, and we really enjoyed listening to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so with that, we come to the end of the list of speakers. And we've had 5 very good presentations, one better than the other, in fact. We began with Serenah, And she talked about querying the romantic canon. While I found it very interesting, I think the paper would definitely gain if you could bring in some text. And you could, balance the theoretical portion with the textual portion. So it would make it more interesting. And whatever you are saying would have validity in the literature of the period. In the same manner, Alexis, I found your paper on Anne Lister most interesting. Particularly, when you talked about the gentleman Jack. But I feel that instead of talking about Lister in a sort of a limbo, maybe you could have a background and, you could put Lister in a particular context. That will make the study more intensive and you would be able to expand your horizon a little. Think about it.
Okay.
We had Apala Kundu talking to us about Mauritius. And Apala, are you still here? No, Apala had to go somewhere. She sent me a message. And well, that paper also, I think it was very interesting, but let's see, think about it. And I would like your opinions also on it. Samrat, your paper on the hijras in India, talking about, I must say that you've gone very deep into it. Is it part of your research, your PhD thesis? Yeah. So it seems, So it seems. But I hope you'll be allowed to send us an essay that we can consider for publication. And particularly, I like the way you began with the tradition, the Hijra tradition, their organization, their formation, their community, their profession, the rules that govern them, and so on. And then you brought it down to the contemporary scene, how they are being used for nationalist purposes. That is something I had not really thought of, but what you say is very right. We see it happening all around us these days. But keeping in mind that the collection of essays that we plan to bring out targets an international audience, just keep that in mind when you do the final version of your essay. And Gonul, while I found your focus on Morris, on E.M. Foster, most interesting, perhaps you could also draw comparisons with the other works of E.M. Foster, because you do find something of that sort in Passage to India also. But I really appreciate the work that you have done. Right now, there are not too many people logged in, but we have Roshan out here and we have Manpreet here. So Roshan, would you like to add something would you like to comment or give your observations on the papers?
Yeah, rather than giving observations, I have little queries, particularly for Serenah. Serenah, I liked it immensely, your presentation. And when you offer these two strategies of querying the canon and reversing the canon, as a pedagogical kind of strategy. So, I mean, how is it done? I'm just interested, just curious. You could come up with a brief response as to how is it done? How is it dealt with in your university or the colleges where you've studied or where you teach? How do they do it there? Are they sensitive? Are they queerness sensitive at all? Or you still need that sensitization, which is utterly, or I would say at times totally lacking in our part of the world.
So my PhD dissertation was all about romantic pedagogy and implementing these tactics and exploring the non-canonical, and mainly focused on what pedagogical methods can we kind of recraft within the canon. So I actually, for a part of my dissertation, what we did at Illinois State University is we did a teaching internship course where we got to come up with the course design. And so for that course, I actually taught studies in Romanticism, and I did it from a completely non-canonical perspective. I was lucky enough where the university that I actually went to was very progressive and a liberal university. So It wasn't anything, they weren't, I would say everyone was already exposed to queer theory, women's intersexuality studies. It's pretty big at Illinois State University. So I was fortunate enough with that where approaching the course, I kind of gave history on the canon and why it's important to think beyond the canon, and explore various intersections of identity. So that was kind of the premise of what I did as sort of like the background work first. And
Okay.
also, so my main thing with all of this is Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality theory. So I explore like beyond just gender, sexuality, race. I go as far as talking about like class, age, just all the intersections of identity and how that is impacted and how we need to sort of illuminate that within the Romantic canon. So my class went really well. Students were really receptive to it. It was a really great course. So that is what I've devoted my studies to now. I did my dissertation on that, and I'm continually trying to progress my teaching and pedagogical methods to think beyond the canon and implement all these other intersections of identity in my studies. And that's currently my goal.
Why, Serena, why I said so was that when it comes to, say, now we also keep kind of, preparing courses, but particularly when it comes to queerness, this still appears to be a big no-no out here. But the point is, like, I mean, you must be having that kind of freedom, to bring in texts that you would decide are relevant, given the background and everything. I was just curious to know. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And yeah, thank you. Yeah, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, I was in charge of bringing in all the texts, so that was something I was really fortunate.
So, Roshan, if I may just add a bit, just so that the participants don't go away thinking that that's what you say is true of entirely of all the universities in India. In our university, I've designed the course. I mean, I take the gender elective, and within that one section on queer, and I have the freedom to choose my own texts, and I discuss those in class. So it's not that all universities really.
I completely agree with you. It's say 15 to 20% or something. But a course, solely devoted to queer literature is still, I mean, that could be a possibility in times to come, of course.
Right.
Because that possibility is there in our, also when it comes to gender studies.
That's what I said, that, you should not go away thinking that.
A part of it is there, and she's right, absolutely. But otherwise, that sensitivity, what I mean is, that was what I intended.
No, that takes time. And generally speaking, in academic circles, everybody is familiar with, queer issues, queer theory.
Queer theory.
So,
and we have had this tradition out here, and from there, I would like to move on to Samrat.
Samrat wants to say something.
Yeah, Samrat, sure.
Yeah, like as to the politics of curriculum construction, and especially in the US, since November last year, the state or the government has entered the classroom here, and we feel that a lot. So, like, especially like depending on what state you are in, if you're in a red state, you were told by the state that you cannot use words like intersectionality, diversity, inclusion. Some states were also told to remove the word women from the syllabus.
Yeah.
Right. So queerness would come much later. So, but I completely agree with Dr. Serenah that, like, if one has the university support over here and the freedom, right, one can bring in a plethora of texts. Like, one can disrupt queerness in so many ways in terms of race, class. And I truly appreciate you kind of building up on Dr. Crenshaw's frameworks. Right. But it depends again, like, because we saw something similar taking place in Delhi University 5 years ago, where all texts on queerness, Dalit minorities were removed from the master's syllabus.
So probably the governments, are becoming less tolerant. So I was going to say that too, that this is within academia, it's accepted till it is brought to the government's notice by some extreme element, and then there would be a clampdown, right? So it's probably just that they are not so aware, as in what's going on.
As long as they are not aware, we are safe. Samrat, just a quick one, just a brief one for you. I mean, you so remarkably and very painstakingly, I would say, aligned your research with Hindu nationalist discourse, for that matter. And that's the most dangerous terrain that you have actually selected for yourself. And you must be aware of the consequences, of course. But this is really interesting, for that matter. I mean, when you approach this entire issue, from the viewpoint of this Hindu nationalist discourse, for that matter, and how they operate, I mean, everything. They also behave more or less the same way out there.